Let's talk about what we're going to be doing over the next class period or 2 or 3 class periods, and kind of what we want to focus on is an introduction, all right? And one of the things that I've sometimes seen, and certainly don't want to spend a lot of time or insult anybody's intelligence, but I was amazed at some of the just lack of information that people had about the court system. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on the court system tonight. We talk about litigation, we'll talk about arbitration, we'll talk about mediation, but before we get into that, I really want to just focus on this whole idea of what this class is about, and that's labor law and employment law. So why do we need, I mean, do we have labor laws? We have them, right? Nobody's going to deny that. So let me ask you this. Why is it that we have employment laws? Amanda. Okay. Amanda?
So there's not discrimination.
Okay. One of the reasons we have employment laws is so there is not discrimination. West Plains?
She said what I was going to say. That's okay.
Okay. All right. So we don't have discrimination. Discrimination in what? Amanda?
Employees.
Okay. But what kind of, yeah, I mean, but what kind of discrimination?
Age. Sex.
Age. Okay. Sex. All right. Springfield, Missouri right now has got a big ordinance going on whether we give protection to homosexuality or gender preference, what we would call gender preference. Okay, so discrimination is one reason that we have employment laws. Why are other reasons? What are other reasons that we have employment laws?
Fair wage.
Fair wage, all right? So we want people to have a fair wage. Or who wants people to have a fair wage? I should say, Tom. Who wants a fair wage?
The people that are working.
The people that are working want the fair wage. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that your employers don't want fair wage, okay? But the people with the primary interest on that is the employee. What else? We've got discrimination. We have fair wage.
Benefits.
What? Benefits, all right, such as what, Tom?
Health care, dental care, vision, unemployment.
Okay. Dental, some people offer it. Certainly health care. It is, if you are an employer, if you get out in what I call the real world and you're hiring people, you're going to find that there is a big difference between attracting employees if you have health care benefits than if you don't have health care benefits. All right? So benefits are a big reason as well. What other reasons? Why else? Jackie?
Safety and liability issues.
Safety and liability issues. All right, and we're going to talk about those. So we've got discrimination, we've got wages, we've got benefits, we've got safety and liability issues. Let me press a little more, Jackie. What do you mean by safety of who?
Safety of your employees.
Okay.
For example, like if they were to get hurt, you know that there's workers' compensation, or that there are laws that you can't have kids working that are like 8 years old
Right.
in the U.S.
Right.
So.
Okay. All right. Safety for the employees. Patrick.
To add on to that, also safety if one of your workers injured someone during a lunch break or something like that, it would also protect them against other individuals that were hurt.
Okay. Yeah, that's you know, other people, co-employees against co-employees. I was at a general council meeting this afternoon, as a matter of fact, and one of the things that they said is the big emerging topic in harassment policies is bullying. And when I think of bullying, where do you think bullying occurs? So yeah, school. And I thought, really? And then I got to thinking about it, and it hasn't reached this area yet, but we are seeing more and more laws focused on this concept of bullying. And you know, recently there was a shooting in front of the Empire State Building, which kind of originated, from everything I can tell, out of a bullying type relationship, co-employee relationship situation. So what else? And West Plains, I don't mean to ignore you, you just have to yell it out, okay? Any others? We've got discrimination, we've got benefits, we've got wages, we've got safety issues, all right? Anything else? The whole reason, if you really want to break that down, is generally we need employment laws because we have competing values, all right? And where's that competition? It's between what? Or between who?
Firms.
Company to company.
company to company. Certainly you have company to company competition. Okay? Lisa, were you raising your hand? Remember, it's like an auction in here, all right? You raise your hand, I'm calling on you, all right? Company to company. Whitney?
Employee to employer.
Employee to employer, right? We do need and do have laws that deal with company to company competition. But when we talk about employer-employee laws, we've got employers that have competing values with their employees. Because employees want what?
Wages.
Employees want wages, okay? They want the best, and how much control do employees want?
As much as they can get.
Huh?
As much as they can get.
Employees.
Oh,
How much control, if you're an employee, Whitney, how much control do you want your employer having over you?
none. No.
Yeah, an employee. Here's the value of the employee. If you boil it all down to its bare essence, the values of the employee is to make as much money with as much of an independent job as you can possibly have. Okay? The employee wants the best independent job for the most money. Now, contrast that with the value of the employer. What is the value of the employer?
Profit maximization.
Maximize profits, okay? Tom says profit maximization, all right? The employer wants the greatest production for the least expense. Now, let's go back to Jackie, for instance. Jackie tells us that employment laws are needed because of safety. When you consider that the employer's value is that I want the most production for the least expense, how does that compete with the employees to have the best job? How does that work into your safety?
As far as safety?
Sure.
Well, it's like if an employer has two options about like safety measures that they could implement, and one is a certain type of technology and the other is like, well, we'll give them a handbook so that they know not to do this. Obviously the handbook's going to be cheaper, and so they'll probably go with that, even though that might not be the safest option for their employees, who would obviously want the most protection and not have to be so cognizant of, what they shouldn't do.
Yeah, Jackie gives a very good example of a situation where if you're trying to work with an employee, you may have two choices. You can tell the employee what to do by way of a handbook, or you can give that employee some actual technology or whatever that they can use. Well, which one's going to be more expensive? Certainly, the technology, the apparatus, if you will, is going to be more expensive than just handing them a piece of paper. And so when you look at that kind of interferes with the employer's idea of having the most production for the least expense. And as a result of that, we then get what we call employment laws, and here you are. Now, when we talk about specific laws, all right, and we're just touching on the introduction aspect of it tonight, but when we talk about these specific laws, what laws are out there that you're already familiar with and may have come familiar with over the last 48 hours, last week, whenever you were reading your text. But what specific laws, areas are there laws out there on? Dave.
Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Okay, was that Crystal or Darla?
Darla.
Okay, Darla, the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Yes.
Okay, Civil Rights Act of 1964. We'll touch a lot on that later on. Dave?
I mentioned age discrimination law.
Okay, age discrimination law. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act is a very specific act that we have. When we talk about discrimination, somebody asked, and I don't remember who it was a good question on disparate impact. Anybody remember from your reading what disparate impact is? And we'll cover this a whole lot more detail when we get into the discrimination area. But anybody remember what disparate impact, or recall that term in your reading? Dave.
I think it's when there's discrimination, even if there was not an intention to discriminate against.
Yeah, really disparate impact is a way of determining that somebody has been discriminated against even if they didn't intend. Now, it's really what we call an evidentiary mechanism. It's really a way of proving discrimination. So I may not intend to discriminate against African Americans, but if I give a test that is so oriented toward non-African Americans that most African Americans are going to fail it, I may have engaged in what we call a disparate impact, okay? And that may seem unfair to some, and yet there are people say, well, wait a second, we don't want you doing things that, you know, are still going to be discrimination. So we have those laws, and we'll talk about those as we go throughout this semester. So we talked about the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, all right? Talked about different discrimination laws. What other laws? Specific laws? The Civil Rights Act of 1964. What else?
ADA.
The Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a huge act right now. And one that, and what we see in employment law is that frequently laws go from one pendulum to the other until they get this balance worked out. And that's where the American with Disabilities Act has come about. When the American Disabilities Act came several years ago, it first came out and everybody had a disability, all right? Everything was a disability, and it didn't matter what it was. I mean, if you had a hangnail, it was a disability, all right? Then the pendulum swung where suddenly nobody had a disability, and the courts were interpreting it. Recently, there is the American Disabilities Act amendments, and the amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, it has swung back the other way, so almost everybody has a disability. The question is, how do you accommodate that? And so we'll look at that in great detail. Other particular laws.
One's about hiring veterans.
Hiring veterans, okay. And we'll talk about that when we talk about some of the discrimination and that you have national laws relating to hiring of veterans, and not only the hiring of them, but if they leave for service, how much time do you have to give them off, and do you have to rehire them? So we'll talk about those as well. Yeah, Dave.
The Fair Labor Law.
Fair labor laws, okay? You've got the Fair Labor Standards Act, which talks about wages, all right? And we'll spend a lot of time, and when you get into that section, you'll go, really, I have to remember all these little details, and there are a lot of them, and it's not necessarily fun, but it helps you understand, particularly if you're in the workforce, whether or not those laws apply or are applicable, okay? And we've talked about, I think somebody mentioned earlier, workers' compensation laws, all right? Somebody mentioned unemployment benefits. Jonathan, were you going to add? Okay. We've talked about unemployment benefits, agency laws, all right? Who is an agent of somebody else? If I'm driving a FedEx truck down the highway and I run into somebody, okay, who's responsible? Dave? FedEx. I mean, I may be as well. Now, interesting, FedEx hasn't really pushed the issue, but I actually tried a case a few years ago with them. Their drivers, and we'll spend a little bit of time on this tonight, their drivers are independent contractors. All right? Now, they don't push that too much because I think they think they're going to lose. All right? And so they're very careful about which issues they push on that. But having said that, most of the FedEx drivers are, or certainly have been in recent past, what they call independent contractors. They have their own contracts and set up their own ID numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So you get into agency laws, you get into independent contractor laws as well. The other area that we'll cover is intellectual property, all right? If you go work for somebody and you create this wonderful piece of work or whatever, who does that belong to? Does it belong to the employer? Does it belong to the employee? And so we'll spend time talking about that. We'll also spend time talking about just a number of other laws. Jackie, were you starting to say?
I was gonna add the Family Medical Leave Act.
Family Medical Leave, okay. Family Medical Leave Act, where if somebody gets hurt, okay, or needs to take care of their family, those are all laws that apply. So when we talk about that, and we can't give all of them in this brief introduction to it, but it gives you the idea that there are a lot of laws and a lot of areas that we can cover. Now, one of the things that you'll find that probably gets into this whole area of employment law, what's the first thing you've got to know? If you're going to study a particular employment law and see if it's applicable to somebody, what do you have to know? And that may be a confusing question. What's the What do you have to have an employment situation?
Claim,
They?
a claim?
Claim, okay. Patrick?
Contract?
Maybe a contract. Amanda?
So you have to have a certain number of employees.
There you go. Before you have an employment situation or an employment relationship, maybe that's the word I should have used, before you can have an employment relationship, you have to have a certain number of employees, or you have to have at least an employer, right? And you have to have an employee, all right? So you cannot have an employment relationship without those two things, an employer and an employee. Interesting, there are different laws as to who is an employer and who is an employee. And I would dare say that one of the most frustrating things about this class is that you're going to find that some laws require, say that an employer, defined as an employer as somebody with 6 employees. Some laws define an employer as somebody with 15 employees. Some laws define an employer with somebody as 20 employees, and some say 2. And that will get, as we go through, you're going to go, really, is this one with 6? Is this one with 15? You know, and we try not to spend too much time on it, but there are some areas that it's really important that you know that distinction. So, who is an employer? Who is an employee? Those are things that law covers. And tonight, at some point, or in a later class period, we're going to talk about the independent contractor and whether or not a particular person is an employee. So with that kind of introduction, any other areas about the laws or the conflicting values between the employer and the employee? All right. So where do we get these laws? We touched on what the laws are. Where do we get our laws? Where do we find our laws? What are some of the sources of our laws?
The federal level?
Okay, on the federal level, Darla, where? What do you mean by the federal level? Give me an example. And you're right.
Like the Fair Labor Standards Act, that's a federal statutory law.
Yeah, it is a federal statutory law. And when Darla says federal statutory law, well, let me ask you, Darla, what do you mean by that? Yeah, see, that'll teach you. Now, what does Darla mean when she says federal statutory law?
The laws made in the court systems or made by administration.
The laws are made, but they're made by the legislature, okay? They're made by our federal House of Representatives and our senators, okay? That's what federal law is, all right? And we're not going to go back and give what was that? You guys probably aren't old enough to remember. Schoolhouse Rock? Yeah. Drew, you're shaking your head as if you remember it. You know, you're too young. You're too young. But you know how a house or how a bill becomes a law. All right, and we look at those type of things. Federal laws. You have your House of Representatives. You have your Senate. You have your legislature that comes together and they make laws on the federal level. Now, where else can you make laws like that?
State level.
Yeah, Tom, on the state level. All right. And sometimes we have state laws that are very similar to federal laws. They may be more restrictive, all right, but they may come out of the same thing. Some states, Jackie mentioned the Family Medical Leave Act, which is a federal law, all right. There are also state laws or states that have their own version of the Family Medical Leave Act, all right. Darla mentions the Fair Labor Standards Act. Okay, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, as you will see when we talk about it in detail, covers wages, okay, and what can be paid and to who it can be paid and things of that, covers overtime. In addition, there are states that have their own minimum wage, all right? So we get into federal laws, we get into state laws, all right? What other sources do we have? Which may sound like a federal law. What's the biggest federal piece of legislation we've ever had, Patrick?
Constitution.
Yeah, the Constitution itself. All right? And so sometimes our employment laws come from constitutional sources. So far you can have laws that are from a statutory, whether it be a federal statutory or a state statutory, federal Congress, state Congress. You can also have laws that come out of the federal Constitution or the state constitution. So we've got constitutional law, we've got statutory law, okay? What else?
Case law,
I'm sorry, what?
case law,
Case law?
case law from the judges, yeah?
Yeah, case law, all right? And case law, when we talk about case law, we're talking about what judges have come up with. In other words, statutes are written, all right? But somebody has to interpret what those statutes mean. And they cannot cover for every little event that might surface. And so what happens is you have court cases, and we'll spend some time in a later class period on court cases, but case law is law that interprets other law. Now, it may be federal law. It may interpret federal law, okay? It may interpret state law. It will interpret all of the sources of law. Does that make sense? Because sometimes, and I think somebody asked it and said, hey, I don't want to ask a silly question, but it's not a silly question, because it's a little confusing sometimes when you get into what's the difference between case law and common law. Because, and I've given you one there, common law is another source, all right? We talk about constitutional law, we talk about statutory law, we talk about case law. What is common law? Anybody? Yeah, Jackie?
It's like a legal standard that came from laws in England.
Yeah, it's like a legal standard that comes from laws in England. Now, where it gets a little bit confusing is frequently your common law may seem like case law. Because if you just look at case law as judges making decisions, well, yeah, that is what case law is. And it can interpret all sources. But common law is a little bit different. And one of the ways to know about common law is how does common law differ from a statute? In other words, if we talk about statutory law or constitutional law, how does common law differ from that? Anna? Oh, I'm sorry. See, I thought you were raising anybody. Jackie?
I guess from my understanding, it's not like a in writing sort of thing. It's like just an understanding that this is the history that we go back to in order to interpret things certain ways.
Yeah, there you go. Jackie says it's not written down as a particular law. It's something that we go back to as a certain way. All right. And really what that means, let's take a situation completely out of the employment context. All right. Let's just take your automobile accident. What law out there says that I can't drive my car into the back of Kyle's car? There was no law that said that, all right? In fact, there was no law when cars first came out that said you shall not drive your vehicle into the back of somebody else's vehicle, all right? And until they made an actual law that said that, you had common law, all right? You can't do certain things to other people's property. And there was not necessarily a law written on the books that dealt with that, but that's an example of common law. Another example of common law is what we call, which we will talk about in here and talk about it in a few class periods, is the employment at will doctrine. All right? What is the employment at will doctrine?
Is that wherever the employee or the employer can quit at any time?
That in its bare essence is what it is. The employee can quit at any time, the employer can quit at any time. We won't get into, in this particular session, into whether it's a good thing, whether it's a bad thing, the rationale for it, but that's it in a nutshell. There was no law originally that said, hey, the employee can quit at any time, the employer can quit at any time. It was just a situation of you've got an employer and employee. Arising out of that said, hey, we got to be careful that we allow people certain benefits. So employment at will kind of came out of that as a common law doctrine. Now, somebody asked me about the question about, well, why Montana? Because I think there's some reference, and you may have read somewhere that Montana is limiting the employee at will doctrine. What that really means is Montana has basically gone to a point where they say, we're not going to allow you to, as an employer, just terminate anybody you want for any willy-nilly reason. All right. There are other jurisdictions out there that put qualifications on the employment at will, and we'll talk about some of those in a few sessions. But Montana has almost done away with it altogether. And by doing away with it, you're not saying that you're not making it more restrictive. You're actually making it less restrictive for the employer. And maybe that's not the best way to say it. Montana, by putting restrictions on the employment at law, have basically said to the employers, we're not going to allow you to fire for any reason that you want. Okay? And so that's what we get into when we get into employment at law. So to kind of recap where we are so far, we've got constitutional law, we've got statutory law, both on a federal and a state level. All right. We also have case law, which is judges interpreting all the sources of law. We have common law. All right. What else do we have? Any others?
Administrative.
Yeah, administrative law. All right. Administrative areas, and we'll spend a little bit of time on that in a few sessions, but administrative law is a little bit different than your court system. It's administrative agencies. For instance, when it comes to employment law, you have an administrative agency called the EEOC. All right? Somebody tell me what the EEOC stands for.
Equal Employment Opportunity.
Yeah. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. All right? EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It is a governmental agency. All right? It is an administration, if you will. And it can promulgate certain laws to some extent. It's created by governmental agencies. The Department of Labor can create some of those. And you may have state agencies as well, like the Missouri, the state version of the federal EEOC is the Missouri Commission on Human Rights. All right? And most states have their own state agency. And when we get into discussing discrimination, we'll spend a lot more time on that issue. So administrative law is another. I think there's one more that we'll want to touch briefly on, won't spend a lot of time on it, is what? I'm sorry, what? Executive orders. All right? And that's basically where the president or state governor can just say, here's the law, this is the way it's going to be, and like it or don't like it. Okay? All right. Now, with that in mind, what kind of questions do you have regarding any of those particular laws or particular thoughts? Just to kind of as a way of discussion, do you believe employers have too much restriction on them? And are our laws geared more in favor of the employers, more in favor of the employees, or just right?
I don't think you can really say if you haven't ever been in that type of situation to have to use them.
Okay. Is that Anna?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you've never been in a work environment on a regular basis, is that what you mean? Or if you've never been in the legal field?
The legal part of employee versus employer.
Okay. All right.
If you had a situation where you got hurt or something and had to go up against them, you wouldn't know until you got in that situation.
That's a good point. Until you've actually been there, you may not know. All right. Somebody take a position that, yeah, even though we're students in this class, we're learning about it, I do think employers have too much laws or the employees have too much rights. Amanda?
Well, I think employers, they have to protect their company, so they have to have these laws in place or they would, have litigation. People sue for various reasons. So I don't think there's too much control, personally.
Okay. All right. Now, somebody take the other position. Amanda says she doesn't think there's too much control. All right. Somebody take the position that there may be too much control. I'm just trying to get a feel for what we have. Go ahead, Patrick.
I would argue the case that smaller businesses possibly would have more regulations possibly on them rather than a corporation or someone where we've seen like Enron and reading about that, where, you know, they've got loopholes and many more people going through different fields to, you know, do whatever they can since they are a bigger organization rather than a small company.
Okay, and that makes a very good point and brings up. We'll segue into something else in just a second. But you're right. Look, the people who, I mean, and you may throughout the course of this semester have some idea of where I stand on a political basis, but I try not to get too political in my courses. But let's take Mitt Romney. All right, Mitt Romney pays what, by his own admission, in taxes? 13%. Okay, 13%. Now, why can't most people pay 13% in taxes? And it goes back to what you said, Patrick.
They can't afford it.
They can't afford it. All right. What does Romney have that most of us don't have? I mean, besides the money anyway.
He has backers and everyone else supporting him.
He has backers. He has people supporting him. He has accountants. He has lawyers. He has people that can go through the loopholes. All right. And so you make a good point. Sometimes the businesses that are larger are much better off than the businesses or can afford to deal with the laws than those who are smaller. Segue that into, somebody asked me, I don't remember who, but somebody said, well, why do we have these different laws for like 15 people? Why not have them for everybody? All right. That was a great question. The reason is, what happens if I try, let's take the Family Medical Leave Act. Jackie, I'm going to pick on you.
Okay.
Do you know a little bit about that act?
Try me, we'll find out.
Okay. What do you know about what do you know about the Family Medical Leave Act?
I know that you can take, I want to say it's like 3 months, I might be off on
No.
it, but it's like if you're adopting a child, if you had a child, it can be like either parent can take off time in order to, you know, get into that parenting situation, or if like you have a close relative that's fallen ill, or if you've fallen ill, it's like you're allowed a certain amount of time to sort of take care of those things
Okay.
without jeopardizing your job.
All right. So to repeat what Jackie says, Family Medical Leave Act, and it covers a lot of those things, but those are very good. You get up to 12 weeks under the Family Medical Leave Act, more or less. We'll look at it in detail, but more or less you get 12 weeks to either take care of the birth of a child, okay, an adoption, or if somebody close to you gets hurt. Now, a lot more than that, but that gives us plenty to work with. What happens if I'm Whitney? Let's go back to you. 8 employees, is that what you told me last week?
8 full-time.
8 full-time employees, all right? Under the Family Medical Leave Act, doesn't apply to you because you only have 8 full-time employees. But what happens if we say the Family Medical Leave Act applies to everybody and it applies to an employer who has 8 full-time employees? How does that business work then? Whitney?
Yeah, I mean, that would be horrible for us. I mean, we can't, I mean, if one mechanic's down a day, it jeopardizes our business for that day, and for an extended period of time, it would just be detrimental.
Right.
To the busy period, so.
Absolutely.
We
And
might be able to find somebody else to fill that position, and if they work out better, I mean.
And then you still got to get rid of them. Can you afford to keep them? No, you got to bring the other one back. And we'll get into all those issues on the Family Medical Leave Act. But that's why, and to whoever asked, I think it's a great question, why the laws aren't uniform. Why do we have some situations where we require just 15 and other why not apply it to everybody? Well, there's an example of why we don't apply it to everybody. And again, you have to understand, how do laws get passed? Really, when we talk about laws themselves, not the case law looking at it, but when we talk about laws, how does a law get passed? Bare essence. I mean, it goes through Congress, right? What's Congress made up of?
Senate or House of Representatives.
All right, House of Representatives, senators. Senators are made up basically, not always, but basically 2 parties. What are they?
Democrats.
Yeah, Republicans and Democrats. Yeah, these are easy questions. They don't get any easier than this, all right? You got Republicans and Democrats. Now, how do they get a law passed? What do they do? Democrats and Republicans agree on everything? No. So how do they pass a law?
They vote though.
They vote. What else?
They bargain with each other.
There you go. They bargain. All right. And so sometimes the same group that wants the Family Medical Leave Act, they want that law to apply to every employer, even if they have only 7 or 8. Whereas the people who don't want that law say, wait a second, we'll give you your act, but you have to apply it to a business that has 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius or whatever. All right. So that's how these laws come about, and that's what we'll be looking at. And from time to time in this class, we may talk about, asking you to take a side or not. The reason we do that is to get you thinking. Education is about thinking. If you've got to be here for an hour at a time or 3 hours at a time, you might as well be thinking while you're doing it. It's the same thing with your questions. As I require the questions, I know some people go, why am I having to write a question here Sunday afternoon at 11:59 or 11:58 or whatever time? The idea is to show me where this class needs to go and to show me what we need to talk about, what other people are wondering. And it gives me some insight as to, hey, that's where this person is confused, or that's where we need to focus our time on. Now, a couple of words about questions. I'm not really too picky on them. But if you say, is chapter 2 about litigation? That's going to tell me you haven't read chapter 2. All right. So make sure when you ask a question, the whole idea behind the question is when you read something, whether it's fiction, or employment law, your mind at some point your curiosity should be piqued, and it should lead you into a particular direction. Ask me those questions, and that'll help, and we'll be happy to answer that. Anything else about the introduction? What we're going to cover next is litigation, but anything else about the introduction aspect of it?